Everyday conditions. Hey, will they give rise to a workers' compensation claim? Well, let's take a look at this week's case. It involves a real man, Terry Lankford. Terry was employed as an investigator for the prosecutor's office in Newton County, Missouri. And at one point in time in his job, he was exposed to some unusual chemicals that arose as he investigated a meth lab. After that, he developed chronic pulmonary obstructive disease. His lungs were going to hell, and he really had some problems, but he continued to work. And he was based in the courthouse in Newton County, and he commonly would take a smoking break, and he was allowed to take a smoking break on the roof of the courthouse. Now, the roof of the courthouse, unfortunately, was a hangout for lots of pigeons. So with pigeons come pigeon droppings, and so on the roof there were lots of pigeon droppings. And he was up there smoking and working on his cases. And he then was diagnosed as having a very unusual condition that basically was a disease that is related to birds and bird droppings. And his condition got worse and worse and worse. He eventually was unable to work, and he brought claim for workers' compensation, and through his attorneys he argued that the exposure to the pigeon droppings had really exacerbated his condition, made it worse, and therefore he was bringing a workers' compensation claim. Well, on the other side of this was the workers' compensation insurer, and they were arguing, no, 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 you don't get coverage because in this instance you've been exposed to pigeon droppings. They're everywhere. They're not just where you were working. Now, granted, there were a larger accumulation of them on that rooftop, but they're everywhere. And people coming to and from the courthouse are exposed to them because the pigeons seem to flock to courthouses. So the case went to a hearing before an administrative law judge, and there the administrative law judge heard these various arguments and said, you know what, Terry, you're right, you have had an exposure to this, and I find that you are therefore entitled to workers' compensation. Well, the insurer didn't like it. They appealed it, went up to the full Workers' Compensation Commission. And there the commission looked at the record, they looked at the various things that had been presented at the hearing, and they came away and they also agreed with Terry and said, yes, your exposure to these pigeon droppings really made your condition worse, and we find it to be a workers' compensation claim. Well, the insurer argued very vigorously, saying, hang on a second. In order to be compensable as a workers' compensation claim, you have to show that it's an unequal exposure. If you've got an everyday substance like pigeon droppings that somebody is exposed to, you have to show for workers' compensation purposes that that exposure was unequal, that there was more exposure in the workplace than there would be generally out in the public. Well, when considering this argument, the commission came away and said, you know what, here Terry basically showed his exposure to the pigeon droppings, and you, Mr. Insurer, have not come up with any evidence which basically shows that his exposure otherwise to pigeon droppings was such that his exposure at the workplace was unequal. The evidence we have right now allows us to draw the conclusion that it was an unequal exposure. You presented no evidence showing it was anything other than that. So what we learned from this case is a couple of things. Part of it's procedural, and that is when you have the burden of proof, you have to demonstrate it. Here, the workers' compensation carrier was unable to basically carry their burden of proof of showing that he had been exposed to pigeon droppings in the rest of his life as much so as he had at work. The other thing we learned from this is there can be everyday instances and everyday substances and everyday circumstances that somebody is exposed to, but if they're exposed to them more so at their workplace than they would be out in the society as a whole, well then the workplace becomes responsible, and if those exposures produce illness, well, it's a workers' compensation claim. All right, bring cases every week so you understand how the law works. I'm David Allen.